It's great to be here today with people who are involved in the advanced market commitment originally, and the pneumococcus advanced market commitment originally. So Alice Albright, who just opened this up, was heard was a co-chair of the Center for Global Development panel with Ruth and me that I like to think was instrumental in the idea of the advanced market commitment. And Amie Batson, who's going to close the panel, was actually involved in the original inception of the advanced market commitment idea back when she was at the bank. And I think it's really an opportune time. I hadn't realized it was a 10-year anniversary of an article of mine, but I don't like to think I'm that old. But I do think it's an opportune time to think about what the experience has been so far with the advanced market commitment for pneumococcus and what the agenda might be going forward. So let me say a little bit about the Center for Global Development report on advanced market commitments or on pull mechanisms. And what that report called for was a commitment by donors to help finance the purchase of vaccines that when they were developed, so this was to cover vaccines that weren't already in existence, and the idea of this commitment in advance to help finance the purchase was twofold. First, it was to help encourage the development of new vaccines that were needed for the developing world, that perhaps had a somewhat different profile than what was needed for the developed world. So you could think, for example, of a malaria vaccine, where there might be some developed world demand, but it's really needed for the developing world. But as I'll explain later, pneumococcus is another case I'll explain why that's relevant in a minute. But the second goal was to ensure access to vaccines once they're developed, because often, historically, there'd really been a 10-year gap or more between the development of new vaccines and their introduction and widespread use in the poorest countries of the world. They would typically get rolled out first in the United States, then make it to Europe, maybe middle-income countries, but it would take a very long time before they got to the poorest countries of the world. And that's actually where most of the deaths are taking place. Okay. So the idea of this advanced market commitment was, in some ways, this was based on the insight, that in the R&D system for rich world diseases involves two elements. It involves a push element, with the government putting in lots of upfront resources into the cost of R&D through things like the NIH in the US or analogs in other countries. It also involves a pull from the prospect of a market. And that gives incentives for pharmaceutical companies to sometimes to do basic R&D, but more often to take the things that have come perhaps from the NIHs of the world and to work on translating what's a great concept into an actual product. And that involves all sorts of work, and conceptual work, but also a lot of very detailed, very boring, but very essential work to actually come up with something that can go in kids' arms in the case of a vaccine or mouths. And it's really the combination of, there are tons of problems with the U.S. system of financing R&D on health. But for all its problems, it's regularly producing products. I guess there's questions now, is it regularly enough? But we've gotten huge gains in health from the technological advances from that system. In the case of the developing world, for diseases that are specific to the developing world, there was really, if you go back a bit further in history, there was really very little of either the push or the pull. We made a lot of progress, not to say that we don't need more on the push side, the Gates Foundation with a greater global interest in public health, but the pull side was still lagging behind. So the idea of the advanced market commitment was to try and supply that missing pull, and to do it in a way that would both incentivize R&D and then help ensure that once the products were developed, they reach the people who need them. So we recommended, in our group, we recommended going forward with this idea. We spent a lot of time trying to think about how could you make it practical, how could you make it workable. And we recommended going forward on two fronts. So first, something that was a major technological challenge, something like a malaria vaccine. Okay? And that offers the opportunity to get both of these benefits, both the technological advancement and getting the product out. But we also recommended going with something that was an easier target, where there was a little bit more R&D work to do, but it was much easier to see how you were, to think that you were going to get there quickly. And that was in part, we wanted to move on both fronts, and that second front, in part, because there's some very important diseases like that, and pneumococcus, as I'll explain, is certainly a case like that. But in part, just to make sure that at a very simple procedural level, this concept would work. Because the concept of an advanced market commitment is that the donors are going to make some promise to help finance the purchase of these vaccines. Well, and then the companies have to make a commitment. They have to build factories, they have to do R&D or build factories, and those are very expensive propositions, and reliance on that. Well, would they do that? Could you write these long-term contracts? It was an open question. So the donors then, I hope influenced by the report, thought about this. They decided they wanted to move initially with this short-run target. And that's what was the origin of the pilot, and that's why the word pilot is in there, advanced market commitment for pneumococcus. So let me say a little bit about pneumococcus for people who aren't familiar with it. Pneumococcus is a disease that, doesn't get a lot of publicity. It must be one of the ones with the highest ratios of deaths to publicity out there. It kills 1.6 million people every year, including up to 1 million children. So it actually accounts for 1 in 4 child deaths. It's a huge, huge killer. Okay? Now, there's been a childhood vaccine for strains of the disease that are common in the West for some time. This was sold for something, in the U.S. it's sold for something like $70 a dose. Okay? So why is this an appropriate target? Well, it's an appropriate target. First of all, that $70 dose vaccine was not getting to people in developing countries. The $70 a dose when you need 3 doses, that's enough of an obstacle right there. But there was another issue, which is there's somewhat different strains of the disease in different environments. And there's some strains that are common in the developing world that were not common in the developed world. So what did the advanced market commitment do? Well, it committed $1.5 billion, and let me recognize the countries. The Italians made the biggest contribution, the UK, Canada, Norway, Russia, this in part because this was done at a G8 summit in Russia, Gates Foundation, and then this was channeled through the World Bank. And tell me if I've forgotten somebody. So under the advanced market commitment, the firms that are entering into what's called a supply commitment, a commitment to supply the vaccine, first they have to develop a product that meets some specifications. So this has to include the strains that are common in developing countries. There's a bunch of other technical specifications to make sure it's an adequate, technically adequate vaccine. They also have to commit to a long-term price to make the supply available at no more than a certain price, and that price was $3.50. So as you can imagine, as you can see, that's a huge cut from the levels in the rich countries. In exchange, what they get is for the first, I believe it's 20% of doses, they get a top-up price through this advanced market commitment. And that top-up price basically doubles, it's roughly doubling that $3.50. Okay, so the average price over the contract period works out to just under $5 per dose. I was involved in some of there were a lot of different committees and I was involved in some of the advisory committees for this, and in addition to being involved in the Center for Global Development Group. There's a lot of discussion about exactly how to structure this, and I'll say something about that, and what price is appropriate. And there was a lot of tension about this offer is out there. How are the firms going to react? We were sort of crossing our fingers and biting our nails. And I don't know if you can do those simultaneously, but anyway. Recently, the firms, in fact, two firms have developed the vaccines that qualify and have accepted the deal and committed to supply vaccines, and vaccines are now reaching kids. So that is, in terms of, we're really thrilled about this. So the overall level, I think this is a huge success. I'll delve into the details in a minute, but these are diseases that kill 1.6 million people a year. We now have a vaccine that's getting out to people. So huge, I think, a huge accomplishment. What are some of the issues that have come up? Well, one issue let me talk about two, just looking back, and I'll say some other things looking forward. One issue is price, and that's got a lot of attention. So there's a group of people who feel like could have got away with less than the price that was charged and should have offered less, and the companies, in their view, the companies still would have taken that deal. Another issue that I'd like to raise is the quantity issue. Okay, so my own take on this is that the price issue it's a difficult problem, and I saw some of that when I was on the committee. I can't go into details on everything I saw on the committee, but there were a group of experts who were charged with doing this. I'm not even going to say I necessarily agreed with every detail. The group came to some decision, but we saw estimates of what the cost might be, and we saw lots of estimates of costs. And I think there are a couple of things that are important to remember when thinking about what's the appropriate price setting. So the first thing is, I think we have to take a realistic view of pharmaceutical company incentives. I don't think we can necessarily assume that if you could somehow find out, and certainly nobody on the committee knew this for sure, what the exact cost of production was. But I don't think we can assume that if we knew that price and we offered that price, the companies would have said yes. Let me say a couple reasons. First, these companies are charging $70 a dose in the U.S. That's a very big that's where their real money is coming from. They don't want to jeopardize that price. Jeopardizing that price is very costly to them. Put yourself in the shoes of one of these companies. They said they were very concerned about that they would build a factory and the demand wouldn't be there. Okay, I think they were partly worried about the cost of building the factory, which are enormous. I think there's another issue that they weren't talking about, and this is conjecture based on my being an economics professor, not based on anything I heard from the companies. If they wound up with excess capacity, they would politically come under very intense pressure, I think, for their pricing, first in middle-income countries and potentially in rich countries. Taking even a small risk of coming under political pressure for their pricing in rich countries is enormously costly. So I think it's not obvious that they would take this deal. Okay? The other issue is thinking about this from GAVI's perspective, or from the global health perspective. The price that's being paid for this, the long-term price is $3.50, the average price $5. At that price, these are enormously effective investments. The cost per year of life saved is something like $100. Okay, what do we pay for cost per year of life saved in the rich world? $50,000, $100,000. You can save a lot of lives with a limited amount of money. Even within the global health arena, there are a lot of things where the evidence just isn't, it's not clear what value for money we're getting. Getting a vaccine with this proven efficacy at $5 a dose average price is a terrific deal. If you try to say, well, we're going to try and, maybe we won't offer $3.50, maybe we can get it for $3. Well, if it goes right, you save 50 cents per dose. If it goes wrong, there's 1.6 million people who are dying of pneumococcus each year. There's a asymmetric loss function. So I don't know what the right decision is on price. In some ways, I don't think we'll ever have a totally definitive answer because we won't know what the companies would have done if they'd been offered another price. But I think it was and I do think it was a reasonable. I can see how this was a reasonable decision for the people who ultimately made the decision under the circumstances. Okay, let me say an area where I do think perhaps another decision would have been appropriate, and that was on the quantity. Okay, so one of the maybe it's worth bringing up the slide right now. I think in part because of concerns about, was this a lot of money going to particular companies? The GAVI made a decision to only call for a limited amount of commitment. They sort of held some of their fire. So here are the projections of vaccine demand. These are projections. Who knows whether they'll be right? This is from the GAVI website. So I'm assuming it's up to date, but. This is the amount of capacity that's committed. They only called for this much capacity. Now, I think if you can see, this is 2013. you're going to start, here's 2012, you're going to start having, according to these projections, you're going to start having shortages pretty soon. Now, in fact, GAVI has some ability to affect the speed at which countries take this up. They can go work with countries and try and get them to take it up. Given this is such a highly cost-effective vaccine, I think it would have made more sense to ask for a greater commitment, a greater supply commitment. And then it takes time to build a factory. So if you don't install the capacity now, you're not going to be able to have it for a while. I think this was motivated in part by, well, we don't want to give too much of the contract to particular firms. Well, to me, I think the health objective is more important. Look, some other firms may later develop vaccines. I don't think they're going to have them soon enough. Maybe there's contrary information to that. And I think you could have said we're going to offer $100 million doses of contract initially. I think the long-term supply issue, the mechanism itself, there's concern if you rely on a few companies, you won't have long-term supply. But the contract itself builds in a commitment to long-run supply. Other producers, I wouldn't argue, labor costs are not a big share of the cost of producing vaccines. So it'd be nice to have an Indian producer there, but it's not like their costs are necessarily going to be that much lower, in my view. Okay. What are the so I think that's perhaps something that could have been done differently. What are the lessons? Well, first, the private AMC worked procedurally. The firms supplied, the contracts got written. We can get vaccines to kids. Second, the new vaccines got out much faster. The new vaccines, these vaccines that covered the strains in the developing world, got out to the developing world very, very quickly. That's historically unusual, and that's going to save a lot of lives. I've seen estimates as big as 7 million lives. I haven't gone over those numbers myself. Third lesson is that we need to assure capacity. And there were some technical things that some of these committees, I was on recommended revisions of the working group to allow greater capacity. But the other thing you have to do is make a big enough order. So one of the things this mechanism can do is allow you to go out and roll this out quickly. You might as well take full advantage of it. Okay. The issue of the price, so I'm not going to say that the wrong decision was made on the price, but I do think we learned something about when you're dealing with a near-term product, it's going to be politically contentious because there's specific, if it's a near-term product, then there's some firm that's close, or maybe a couple of firms that are close. That means that if you offer a slightly higher price, people are going to say, well, you're favoring those companies. I think there's advantage, before I thought there were big economic advantages. I would still stick with the conclusion of the original Center for Global Development report. You want to do the near-term products because you want to get them out there, but I think there's also a case for early-term products, both to spur the basic R&D that's needed, to get it out when it's out, but I would add a political advantage, which is from a sort of technical economics point of view, if you offer a higher price, the rents will be competed away. It's not that you're giving rents to a particular firm. There's more firms that can enter the market, or firms that are already in the race can intensify their efforts. And so you won't be giving, if firms react rationally to this, it's not that there's a particular identifiable firm which is going to get this. It's going to be a competition. More firms will spend resources entering that competition. And I think that's not only economically attractive, but it's also politically attractive. It's as I think it's therefore worth looking, in addition to the pneumococcus AMC, to think about what are some more distant targets. And that's a big technical decision. Should that be malaria? Should that be TB? Should it be something else? I'm not going to try and answer that question. It's also worth thinking about other areas for advanced market commitments. And in that regard, I think it's worth noting that the Canadians, who are a key player in the vaccine advanced market commitment, are now launching a scoping process to think about an agriculture advanced market commitment for products that are needed for the developing world. And there, I think it would really make sense to think not only about a short-run target, but also about a technologically more distant target. Thanks very much.